welcome to another one of our public health themed Lunch and Learn webinars. I'm Vanessa Becker and I'm with Douglas Public Health Network, and I'm joined by several of our team here today. This session is sponsored by DPHN and Thrive Umpqua in partnership with the Oregon State University Extension Service office here in Douglas County. We're delighted to welcome three panelists today. Please join me in welcome Mandy Hatfield and Logan Bennett from OSU Extension Service. They're going to share tips to maximize your garden's potential this season, benefits of each style of food preservation and other local foods all year round, food preservation, safety, and resources. And then we're also delighted to introduce our own Emily Porter, our communicable disease epidemiologist at DPHN, to talk about food safety. I'm personally very excited about listening today as I've been working on planning my own garden and food preservation projects for the summer, and how to have a safe barbecue and potluck, which Emily's going to cover. So just a few logistics as we normally do go over. Please put your questions in the chat, and myself and Kendra will be watching for those. Your mics and cameras are going to be turned off during the webinar. This session is being recorded and we'll post it on our YouTube channel and our website in the coming weeks. If you prefer to read closed captions, please click on the bottom on the button at the bottom of the Zoom screen that says Show Captions. I think Kendra's going to put that in the chat as well. And reminder that we're giving out several books titled Sustainable Gardening, the Oregon-Washington Master Gardening Handbook, as virtual door prizes. So watch your email after this session to see if you've won one. A second reminder, check out our DPHN website for upcoming Lunch and Learns this summer. We've got another one coming up in May, which I'll talk about at the end of this session. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Mandy, Logan, and Emily. Logan Bennett is the Small Farms and Master Gardener Program Coordinator at the OSU Extension Service. Logan graduated from Oregon State University with a bachelor's degree in Natural Resources Management and a master's degree in Soil Science. Logan worked in the agricultural sector as a crop scout and agronome. I can never pronounce that correctly, Logan. Agronome. I'm going to let you say that for 2 years. Logan is consulted on integrated pest management, pesticide and fertilizer recommendations, and cultural practices to maximize crop yield and return on grower investment. Logan has spent much of his time in the field scouting crops for insect, pests, fungal diseases, and important crop growth stages. Logan has worked with crops such as blueberries, caneberries, hops, and cherries, and he's also worked with organic row crops at the Oregon State Organic Growers Club and specialty crops in organic and conventional systems. And I'll hand it off to him in just a minute. I'm going to do quick bios for Mandy as well. Mandy Hatfield is a senior instructor in nutrition education and outreach programs at the Oregon State University College of Health and Douglas County Extension Service. Mandy coordinates the Douglas County SNAP Ed program and Master Food Preservation program. In Douglas County, the SNAP Ed program works closely with many partners, including Mercy Foundation, Feeding Umpqua, Douglas County Food Bank, Take Root, and Local Parenting Hub, and many collaborations through the work at Thrive Umpqua. Emily Porter is an epidemiologist with Douglas Public Health Network, where she specializes in communicable disease case investigation and outbreak response. Her work focuses on protecting community health by monitoring and responding to diseases, including foodborne and waterborne illnesses, respiratory illnesses, and hepatitis. She brings experience in outbreak investigation, health information management, and data visualization to support effective public health decision-making. In addition to her public health work, she also is participating in the Master Food Preserver program through the Oregon State University Extension Service, helping to promote safe food handling and preservation practices in the community. She's also a certified lead-based paint inspector and risk assessor through the Oregon Health Authority. So those are our three amazing panelists. And so I'm going to hand it over to Logan, and I'll bring up your slides as you get started.
All righty. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Logan Bennett. And today we're going to be talking about starting your spring garden and kind of thinking about what you should be planting now, maybe where you should be planting it, and what you should be looking at for the future. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. The first thing that we want to be thinking about when we're choosing our garden space is choosing the right space and right crops at the right time. That's how we're going to have a successful garden. So move on to the next slide here. When we're thinking about what we want to grow, we want to talk about what site we choose before we plant it. So every year, I do this myself. I over-purchase plants or seeds, start a bunch of seeds, and think about where I'm going to plant them after I've run out of room. So it's important to think about that beforehand. If we're going to plant, we'll go back one. If we're going to plant, for example, fawn lilies, ferns, or more native plants, you might want to be thinking about a shady spot. Whereas if we're looking at doing vegetables, fruits, we want to think about a place that typically has full sun. Now, there are some plants, vegetables specifically, that do well in partial shade areas, as examples, lettuce and spinach. But for the most part, if we're thinking about planting out a garden that's edible, we want to be thinking about a spot that has full sun. So we can go ahead and move on to the next one. The other thing that's really important is thinking about soils. So for most vegetable crops, we're looking at a well-drained soil. Over here on the other side of the screen here, this is what a soil texture triangle looks like. So for the most part, we're looking towards the bottom of that for the sandy clay loams, the loams, and the silt loams for planting vegetables in. As you get higher than that, sandy clays, clay loams, silty clays, and clays, they don't do well for most vegetable types. So at home, if you've got the kind of soil that cracks during the summer and is really hard and then is really muddy during the winter, that's typically not a soil that we want to plant vegetables in. One way to look at this, if we're not totally sure if we have a well-drained soil, is how long does it take for your yard to drain after a day of rain? If you've got a day of rain, the next day it's sunny, and your yard's dry, then you have a well-drained soil. If it's the day after and it's sort of dry, it's maybe a little bit wet, you might have what we call a somewhat well-drained soil. That is an actual soil term. And the other thing is look at your soil's texture. So if you grab a handful of it, does it feel gritty? Can you see visible particles in it? That usually is a good indicator of sand. And then what color is it? If it's really dark, like almost black, we call that molic, and that can be a good indicator that it's going to be a well-drained, agriculturally important soil. Now, there is some context to that. People around here call it black mud. It's called a vertisol. Those are also typically really dark soils, and while they're nutrient rich, they tend to be poor to grow in because they don't drain well. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So if we're in a position where we don't have great soils to grow in, raised beds can be a really good option. If your native soil isn't ideal, we can kind of customize what goes into a raised bed. So if you're using one of these, we want to make sure that we're using potting soil or raised bed soils in them. You can also use a mixture of potting soil and topsoil. Just make sure that the topsoil you're using is well drained. The other thing that I recommend is don't just put pure compost in your raised bed. The reason for that is compost is meant as an amendment because it tends to be nutrient rich. So if you use only compost in the bed, we can run into an issue where you have too much nutrient and you can actually damage your plants from fertilizer burn or salt burn. If you want to grow only in the raised bed, so you don't want contact between the plants and the raised bed and then your native soil, making a taller bed is better. Especially if you plan to do root crops, we want to think about doing at least 18 inches of raised bed material so that you make sure that you actually have space for your carrots or your parsnips to grow. And then for non-rooting crops, you don't necessarily have to fill that entirely with soil. So for example, if you have a raised bed for flowers or a raised bed for broccoli or something like that, or even blueberries, you can fill that bed partially with sticks, cardboard, and other carbonous substances that will break down over time. It's actually an adaptation of a really ancient form of horticulture called hugelkultur, where you use wood to break down and make more soil material over time. Now, typically that was done with logs and large berms, but we don't necessarily need to do it that way. We can use a raised bed to produce a similar effect. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So as we're thinking about where we're going to plant, this isn't as big of a deal with broccoli, but we want to think vertically and horizontally. So we want to think about nearby trees, power lines, things like that, especially if we're going to be planting crops that can grow large, like a grape. I've seen grapes crawl up trees into power lines before, and we want to avoid that when possible. But we also want to be thinking about trees in terms of sun availability. So if we're planting a crop that needs a full sun regimen of sunlight, we don't want to plant directly under a tree or in a place where the shadow from that sun is going to be in the way of the vegetables for, more than 3 hours a day. In that case, we may not have enough sunlight for those vegetables to grow well. Now, depending on the kind of crop you're growing, we can think about planting where there's going to be partial shade. So, for example, with leafy greens like lettuce or spinach, if you only get morning sun, that can be a good place to grow those. But when we're thinking about tomatoes, potatoes, other solanaceae, things that really prefer full sun, we can't really get away with just the morning sun. Okay, next slide. Another thing that's really important is water access. So I used a real picture in this one because I wanted to show you guys what this actually looks like. So overhead irrigation can be useful, especially if it gets really hot. Overhead irrigating can cause a microclimate that's sometimes less 15 degrees less Fahrenheit. Yes, too much sun can be a thing depending on the crop, but we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. It's a great question. Um, Back onto the irrigation. Overhead irrigation can be useful, but typically I prefer drip irrigation. There's less chance of fungal issues and disease issues. I typically recommend watering in the morning. And when I say the morning, if you can, like 4 in the morning, when possible, and in the evening if not. And try not to water in the middle of the day. What we end up with is a lot of evapotranspiration. That's a fancy way of saying water coming off of the plants. It creates a really humid environment around the plants and can cause fungal issues. So the picture here shows a timer, a pressure regulator, and a filter. This all screws onto your garden faucet, and then you put the drip irrigation on the other side. These setups can be made for $50 to $100, and they can auto irrigate for you. So earlier I was talking about irrigating at 4 in the morning. You can set this setup to do that for you so you don't have to touch it. And that's a good way to make sure that you're consistently watering and watering at the right time. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Soil temperature is also super important. So most plants have a soil thermotolerance, and what that means is how hot does the soil have to be before they actually grow well? So for tomatoes, it's between 55 and 60 degrees. Personally, I wait till the soil is 57 degrees to plant. That's just because it's worked well for me. If you plant at 55, it's going to be fine. Soils take around 2 weeks to change the temperature at 6 to 8 inches. 6 to 8 inches down is what we're typically calling the growing zone. So that's why it's important to know when that soil temperature is going to change. And then if we plant too soon, we have a risk of shocking a plant or stunting it. So, for example, even though it's April 8th today, if we put out tomatoes now, there's a pretty good chance that they'll be stunted because the soil is still too cold for them to be growing effectively in. Okay, let's go to the next one. The other thing to pay attention to are microclimates. So your individual garden space is likely to have a different climate than the overall hardiness zone. So depending on where you're at in Douglas County, you might be 8A all the way to 9B. However, in your particular garden, especially if you're near a house or at the bottom of a hillside or in a pocketed area, it may be warmer or colder where you're at. So it's something to think about when putting plants in a specific place, especially if we're looking at perennial plants. If you end up putting them in a cold pocket, they're going to have long-term issues. Okay, we'll go to the next one. The other thing to think about, especially if we're just starting gardening, if this is your first year, the scale of gardening is important to consider. If we're first-time gardeners, start smaller than you think. Gardening is an extremely rewarding thing, but it also takes a lot of effort. So we want to make sure that we're getting a return on our investment, not only financially, but I mean, in terms of feeling good about what we've done. And if you start with a smaller garden and have a lot of success, then you can apply that to larger projects year after year. And then once you're really comfortable, you can have a large scale garden that's really functional. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Weed management is super important, and this is the time of year to do it. So weeds are just starting to pop up, most of them, unless you've got something like vinca, which I put this in here because I'm dealing with vinca right now. It's already in bloom. We want to make sure that we take control and take care of the weeds now so that they're not a problem in our garden in the future. Weeds can scavenge nutrients from the plants we're intending to grow. They can overshadow the plants we're intending to grow and take up space that we don't want them to. So we want to try to get rid of them when we can. And to do that, we want to follow the integrated pest management steps, which we'll look at in the next slide here. When we're talking about integrated pest management, we want to approach not only pests, weeds, anything that we're trying to get rid of in this order. Cultural, so something like occultation, that's the tarp being put down here. shade out and reduce oxygen for the weeds. Physical, which can mean machine pulling or hand pulling. Also, you can use heat to get rid of them, like a flamer. If you do that with caution and make sure to read the directions first. Biological controls can also be very effective on a lot of pests, including weeds. Pictured here is the cinnabar moth, and then chemical. So we want to do them in that order to make sure that we're effectively treating for the pests that we have. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So if we go through our cultural, physical, and biological options and we get to the chemical option, what is the better choice, organic or conventional? Well, regardless of your choice, always follow the label. The label on any chemical used in pest management is a legal document, so we have to make sure that we're following the directions on that. And it's also important to know that organic chemicals are still pesticides, right? So if we're treating organically, but chemically, we're still using pesticides. Organics tend to be made of non-synthetics, and they don't persist in the environment as long. And what that means is they usually have to be used more often because they aren't persisting in the environment. Conventional chemicals are made of synthetics. They tend to persist in the environment and they have a longer efficacy, so they work for a longer time after the application. So that persistence in the environment is both a positive and a negative. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So when making a decision about organic or conventional treatments, the most thing to do is choose the right chemical for the right pest. If we're applying an organic or a conventional chemical for the wrong pest, we're not only not going to treat that particular weed or bug or whatever, but we're wasting money, we're being inefficient, and we're releasing chemical into the environment that isn't necessary. So regardless of your choice, one way or the other, make sure that you're following the label, using the correct timing, and using the correct chemical for the pest that you're after. Okay, we'll move on to the next one here. So what should we be planting right now? So peas, we're a little bit farther into the season for peas, but you can still direct sow them into the soil. And when I say direct sow, I mean actually take the pea seed and put it directly into the ground at 1 to 2 inches. You can do bushing or climbing varieties still right now. If you do climbing varieties, they're going to need a trellis. And these guys can be sown or planted pretty close together, 1 to 3 inches apart. And you can have a really good pea bush if you do it that way. Next thing would be broccoli. These can be started indoors, which is what I recommend, or they can be direct sown. The reason I recommend indoor sowing, and we'll see it later on in the presentation as well, is because the competition is a lot less for these slow-growing bulb crops, and so they tend to be better started indoors and planted outdoors. These guys don't need to be planted very deep, only about a 1/4 inch, but they do need more space than peas, around 4 inches apart. And then move these to the garden if they're a few inches tall. And we'll look at the next one here. Beets, one of my favorites personally. They should be sown directly into the soil. I recommend sowing 2 seeds in each planting hole just to make sure that you have some good success. We only sow these about a 1/2 inch deep and at 1 to 2 inch spacing. That way we can ensure a larger success over a row. And then once they get to about 4 inches tall, we start thinning the seedlings to about 2 to 4 inches of spacing, depending on the variety of beet you have. Look at the next one here. Radishes, you can sow radishes most times of the year. What you'll see is if you sow them later in the year, like from fall into winter, they won't have as much flavor as they do right now. So this is a good time to be sowing if you like that radish flavor. We're going to put these directly into the ground. They're barely covered, so almost surface sown. And then sow these guys in a line and then thin after the true leaves sprout. Depending on the variety you get, radishes can be very thin and long or very wide and short. So depending on that variety is how much you'll need to thin them. Okay, lettuces can be started indoors or outdoors. I start them indoors because of competition issues. They're once again sown really thinly, about a 1/4 inch. We move these guys outside when we start seeing true leaves and the plants are 2 to 3 inches tall. So you should be able to identify it as a lettuce before it goes outside. We want to space these 6 to 8 inches apart, especially if we've got like a heading type. We want to make sure that they have enough room to actually grow. And then if you want lettuce all summer, you can start sowing now and then sow every 2 weeks from now till the end of the season, and you can have lettuce continuously. Okay? Potatoes. So right now we can plant potato seeds outdoors. What a potato seed is a chunk of potato that has a growing eye on it. So you can typically buy whole potatoes and cut them up, or depending on the size of the potato, you might plant the whole thing. We want to use certified seed potatoes. So yes, you can go to the store, oftentimes buy a potato and plant it. But the issue with that is they tend to have more diseases than a certified seed potato would. So we want to stick with those certified ones. We want to plant these 3 to 4 inches deep with the eyes, that's the growing point, facing upwards. And then they produce a lot underground. So they need to have some decent spacing, 10 inches up to a foot. And then when you can, just make a little hill out of the soil where you're planting them and put the seed potatoes in that. All right, we'll move to the next one. Oh, there we go. So what shouldn't go outside yet? Corn shouldn't be planted yet. It should be direct sown when it's about 60 degrees. Tomatoes should be started indoors. If you haven't started tomatoes yet, you might want to start buying transfers to go out in about a couple weeks. If you do have tomatoes growing right now, these are my tomatoes. This is a red cherry variety. What I'm doing with these right now, instead of planting them out, as you can see, there's a lot in that little 6 pack. I'm starting to transplant them. So I'm moving them into 3 inch pots, and then probably in 2 weeks to 3 weeks, we'll start planting them outdoors. For beans, you can start direct sowing in May. Cucumbers, you could start indoors right now, or you can direct sow in May, and then squash will direct sow in May. All righty. Any questions?
Great. Thank you, Logan. I'm having some computer difficulties, so I'm going to hand it over to Kendra to share slides, and we'll introduce Mandy to start speaking about preservation.
There was a couple questions what about too much sun? Is that a thing?
It can be. So, especially if you overwater. So, like if you're overhead watering on tomatoes later in the season, you have a really high chance of getting sunburn. So, for a plant like that, you'll want to make sure that you're reducing watering as the fruit's coming out. And then for some plants, like especially like ferns, oversun can be a big deal. For fruit trees, you can also get sunburn as well. So when you go back to prune them, you want to make sure that you have sun on the trunk. And typically you want to paint the trunks when they're younger.
And then when is the best time to plant asparagus?
So right now, we're pretty close to actually wanting to plant asparagus crowns. You can do that in probably a couple weeks once the frost risk is completely gone. And then if you have specific questions about asparagus, let me know because they can be a little bit difficult to plant. So reach out to me and I can help you work through that.
Great. Thank you, Logan. That was very helpful. And Logan's going to stick around too. So if we have time at the very end after Mandy and Emily talk, we'll take some more questions. So we'll hand it off to Mandy. Thank you.
Thank you. Today, I'm going to talk about utilizing all those foods that you just grew and doing them safely to preserve them and enjoy them for longer throughout the season. Especially excited about asparagus because today I'm going to talk specifically about pickling and jelly making. I'm going to start with how we keep our food safe. There's 4 principles that we like to talk about when we talk about food safety, and that's clean, separate, cook, and chill. Those are things to really remember. And when we talk about clean, we're not just talking about keeping our hands clean, which is so important to always have clean hands when you're prepping food, but also scrubbing fruits and vegetables. There's been multiple outbreaks from fruit, like cantaloupe has been a big one in Oregon, where those items being laying on the ground need to be scrubbed before they're cut because you're cutting from the outside through the area where you're going to be eating. So making sure we're scrubbing fruits and vegetables really good. Separating foods to avoid cross-contamination, keeping meat protein separate from vegetables and fruits when cutting, maybe having separate cutting boards, even keeping proteins, animal proteins at the lowest setting in your refrigerator so there's no potential for cross-contamination even within your refrigerator. Cooking foods adequately. We'll talk a little bit about temperatures when we talk about preserving, but it's very important that foods get cooked to proper temperatures to kill any potential bacterias, and then chilling foods safely. So want to make sure that foods are put in the refrigerator within 2 hours of cooking. We want to bring those temperatures down as quickly as possible. The danger zone is 140 to 40, where bacteria really like to grow. So the faster we can get it through that zone, the better. All right, next slide. All right, so when we're talking about food preservation, there are a variety of factors that we look for to keep food safe. So bacterial growth in foods is controlled by 6 main factors. Um, Takes into account the food that you're actually preserving, the acidity of that food, the temperature at which you're like preserving the items, the amount of time that it takes to preserve those items. Oxygen is a really big one. So when you pressure can or water bath can, you're actually taking the oxygen away from those items. And then moisture content is very important, especially when we talk about things like dehydrating. We want to reduce the water availability for bacteria to grow. And also, when you make jams and jellies, believe it or not, moisture is really one of the critical components as well. Next slide. So when we talk about acidity, we talk about it in terms of pH. Botulism is one of the main concerns when we're preserving foods that we really don't want to have happen. And 4.6 pH is kind of like that magic number. Foods that have that are high in acid and low in pH, that are below 4.6, botulism doesn't grow and create toxins at that level. Things that are above 4.6 is where we really want to have extra safety built in. And so that's why we talk a lot about acidity. And then water availability is another big thing. Bacteria and yeasts and molds all need a certain amount of water activity to actually produce and grow. There's a range of activity, one being water. And then, as you can see, honey is down there at 0.65 to 0.6. Even though we think of honey as being kind of like a liquidy type item, it actually has very low water activity because the sugar binds to the water, making it not available for bacteria. Another factors that we talk about is how the foods have been handled. Have they been in the refrigerator? What temperatures have they been held in? And then the origin of the foods as well is another important safety factor. Next slide. All right, so when I was thinking about the foods that are coming into season, jams and jellies popped into my head because fruits are some of the first things that we pick, and a lot of people like to make jams, jellies, and fruit spreads. The other thing about jams and jellies is sometimes you can use your frozen leftovers from last year. So I kind of went crazy picking blueberries and I still have a gallon bag of them left. I can take those out and still make great jams and jellies. So that way I have room in my freezer for all the things that I'm going to pick this year. Safety concerns when we're talking about jams and jellies, the items that we're controlling for to keep them safe is water activity. So the amount of moisture available for microbial growth, and pH. So a lot of times you see that the foods that we're making into jams and jellies are those fruits that are high acid. So we don't have to worry as much about microbial growth, but there are a few fun ones like pepper jelly, which do not have a 4.6 or below pH, and so we're adding acid to them. You want to make sure that we're following tested recipes. Jams and jellies are very much a specific science and actually getting them to gel. Next slide, and we'll talk a little more about that. So when we're talking about gelling for jams and jellies, it actually has multiple parts that need to come together. It happens because there's high amounts of sugars in there. The sugar binds up the water, so it makes less water available for microbial growth. And then actually, acid is needed to actually help with the binding as well. So there's still water available, and you need that acid in there to help the gelling all come together and set. So lemon juice is frequently added to most, especially when you use commercial pectins to get the gel. There are a few fruits that actually have enough natural pectin, and you can make your own natural pectin. However, it's very time consuming. But foods like blackberries, plums, and quince have very high levels of their own natural pectin, and so you probably need less of the acid to actually make that happen, and you can actually create some without commercial pectins. And then most fruits, like I said, are below 4.6, but there are a few that we see in jams and jellies, and those ones are very important that we add acid to, and that's like our hot pepper relishes, our fig preserves, anything that has ripe mangoes. Um, Green mangoes actually have a very different pH than ripe mangoes, so you even want to make sure that you're reading what ripeness of fruits that you should be using on specific recipes. And mangoes are a really, really good example of that. Papaya is another one that you might see. Next slide. All right, so there's multiple different ways that you can make jams and jellies. You can can them for shelf, so they're shelf stable, so you can have a large batch and it's available throughout the year. Most jams and jellies you have to process for at least 5 minutes, but for sterilization purposes, if you have not sure if your jars are fully sterilized or you just want that extra level of safety, you can always process them for 10 minutes and that helps with sterilization. Jams and jellies, we usually recommend for top quality, they use within 6 months, but low sugar ones actually need to be used quicker. You'll also even notice in the refrigerator that low sugar ones often mold faster than other ones, and that's because they have a little bit higher water availability because of the reduced amount of sugar. So not as much of that water is bound up that way. And then you can also make freezer jams. And those use usually uncooked fruits, and you're stirring rather than cooking to dissolve the sugar and the pectin. And then you can put them in the freezer and pull them out when you're ready. I like a variety. I've found that some items I like better frozen, like strawberry frozen is, I think, really good. I love the fresh flavor of the strawberries that you get out of freezer jam. Whereas the cooked, the strawberries kind of get darker looking, and I feel like they lose some of their really great flavor components. Whereas I feel the opposite way about raspberries. I've tried raspberry freezer jam, and it is not quite as ideal because the raspberries don't like to release their own natural juices. But when you heat them up, they do. And so raspberry is one of our family favorites. There's so many fun jams and jelly recipes. And there's a variety of different companies you can look at. You have Ball that puts out recipes, and then the brands of pectins as well. And Pomona pectin is one that gives you a little bit different option in how to make your jams. They use a calcium water to help bind up some of the water and help with the gelling process. So you can actually get away with using less sugar. So if you're looking for less sugar options, they have a great cookbook and a variety of items. Tomorrow we'll be making jam with our master food preservers, and we're going to be trying one of the Pomona pectin recipes. It's a brand new one. It's a orange mango mint jelly. It'll be great for a glaze on barbecues this summer. I like to use jams and jellies not for peanut butter sandwiches, but more for dressings, for glazes. I use an apricot spread for with rice vinegar for a three bean salad. It's kind of got an Asian flair with ginger. So there's a lot of other ways to use jam and jellies that really kind of give your food a little pop. So give some different ones a try. One of the new ones that I really liked last year was a chocolate cherry jam, and it has an amazing smell, and it works great as a filling in a chocolate cake if you really like that combo. All right, next slide. All right, the other thing that I was thinking about when I thought about the items that get harvested at this time of year is asparagus. And when I think of asparagus, I just love pickled asparagus. So that's why I thought of talking a little bit today about pickling. Most of the time when we're pickling things like vegetables that are low acid with pHs above 4.6. And there's actually two different ways you can pickle items. And so the process of pickling is to acidify low acid foods to preserve them. So you can do lacto fermentation, and that's fermented or brine pickles, which that has been around very, very long. That's one of our very first forms of preservation is lacto fermentation. And then a newer way of pickling is quick pickles, which are using vinegars to quickly reduce those pHs. Next slide. All right, fermented pickles. So, I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with some of the forms of fermentation. It's been really popular lately. Sauerkraut and fermented cucumbers are what's pictured here, but some of the really popular ones lately have been kombucha, kimchi, and sourdough is a form of fermentation. So there's a lot of different ways that you can ferment foods. And because of the process of fermentation, it creates great prebiotics that help with gut health. So fermentation is acidifying naturally low acid foods with lactic acid bacteria, which consumes carbohydrates in the food and produces acid. So when you're creating fermentations, you're using high salt concentrations. It's very important. The salt helps with this lactic acid process, and it helps outcompete the bad bacteria. So that's kind of what's happening when you're creating a fermentation. You're hoping the good bacteria win out. And so by following approved written recipes, you'll have really good guidelines to ensure that that is happening in there. This process takes quite a long time. Things like sauerkraut usually take 3 to 5 weeks, where they sit in a salt brine at room temperature, and you're checking on them and making sure that they still look good, smell right. But then things like kimchi happen a lot faster, where kimchi takes 3 to 5 days to ferment. So key safety factors are you really cannot reduce the salt concentration in your recipe. And because we want the good bacteria to outcompete the bad bacteria. Allow sufficient time for acid to develop before refrigerating or processing. And throw out any ferments that develop a disagreeable odor or mold growth. One of the key factors in making ferments is like sauerkraut, keeping that brine over the top of your items. And so that way there's no pieces sticking out of the brine where they can mold or go bad on you. Next slide. All right. So once you get to the point where you're like, ooh, I love the flavor of my kimchi. I actually have some in my fridge right now. And it took about 3 to 4 days, I think, where I was like, oh, I really like this flavor. So I went ahead and you move it to your refrigerator. I wanted to look for, does it have a sour taste? And we want to look for the colors to start changing from bright to dull. You might have noticed that in the sauerkraut and the pickle picture. They become more translucent. When fully fermented, you can store in your refrigerator for 4 to 6 months, but you always want to check for mold. If it molds, it is something you want to get rid of. You can fully fermented dill pickles or sauerkraut, so that way they are shelf stable. But in the canning process, you do kill off some of those healthy gut bacteria that you've created. So most people don't like to can it, but it is something you can do if you enjoy the flavors. Next. All right, and then quick pickles, which I also love. And this is the addition of vinegar to lower the pH of low acid foods. It happens much more quickly than fermentation. You're wanting to look for recipes that have at least a 1-to-1 vinegar to water ratio. Can be more vinegar. You just don't want more water than vinegar. It's a short brine toss process before processing. Sometimes they sit overnight, but rarely is it more than that kind of processing time. Often, a lot of times, you can prep the items, put the vinegar in, heat them up, put them in your jar, and that's all it takes. You want to make sure for the safety that you use 5% or greater vinegar. All recipes are accounted for using 5% vinegar. You cannot reduce the vinegar ratios. That's part of the safety. And then if you're looking at old recipes, a good rule of thumb is to make sure the vinegar is at least 1-to-1 ratio to water. If there's more water than vinegar, it's probably not a recipe that would be approved for use. All right, next slide. Okay, so you can do a canned quick pickles or you can do refrigerated. I love both, and I do both frequently. So refrigerated pickles are great. You're adding your brine, which I use the 1-to-1 ratio, and then I can play with all the spices. So if I'm feeling like a spicy one, I put lots of red pepper. When I make cauliflower, I love to put turmeric in it and mustard seed and dill and garlic. I really have fun with all of my refrigerated pickles, and it's a great way to extend the life of produce. So if I am using half my head of cauliflower for a recipe, I can go ahead and chop up the rest and I can blanch it for 2 minutes. Then I can put it in my brine for my refrigerated pickle, and now it can last in my fridge for 3 to 4 more months while I'm eating on it. So it really extends the life. You can do cucumbers and onions without blanching them. So you can just cut them up and toss them in your brine, whatever flavor profiles you kind of want. If you're doing things like cauliflower, carrots, asparagus, green beans, you want to blanch those for 2 minutes and then do an ice bath, and then you can toss them in your brine. They're super quick. They taste great. I think they're fun to play with. You can even start by just doing pickling spice. That's what we did for kids at school with asparagus, and it was such a huge hit. The kids absolutely loved it, and even had a teacher at one of the schools go, "Why do I like this? I don't like asparagus and I don't like pickles, but this is so good." So I definitely recommend giving it a try. And you can also can recipes. During cucumber season in the summer, I like to do both refrigerated pickles that last enough for me for 3 or 4 months, and then I usually do a batch for my pantry as well. I process those in a boiling water bath, but you can also do a low temperature pasteurization for cucumber pickles. So if you find that you're having issues with your pickles being kind of soft, this is a great option to give a try as the low temperature pasteurization. See if that helps with your pickles being crispier. There are a variety of other things you can do, like pickle crisp, grape leaves are an option, and then just making sure that you cut off the blossom end of a cucumber. It actually emits enzymes that soften the fruit, so make sure to trim off your cucumber ends before you process them as pickles. So lots of fun ways that you can preserve all of these great foods that Logan was talking about growing. And feel free to give me a call if you're looking for certain recipes or if you have a certain item you'd like to preserve. We also have a statewide hotline that you can call and get answers about preservation year round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. I was writing down mad notes as we went. Does anyone have questions? Looks like I've got one question. If I have a pressure canning tomatoes, do I have to add the acid into the recipe? Or maybe we'll ask that one first, and then I'll ask the rest of the question. Or maybe
Yes.
you're probably
Yep. The tomatoes, all the recipes have been calculated for the extra acid. So even when they're doing pressure canning, those recipes are tested for safety based on that extra acid being in there. You would actually have probably a different processing time if the acid was not in there, but that has not been tested.
great. We have another question. Does pasteurization decrease nutrients in food?
Pasteurization. You know, they're probably certain nutrients, not all nutrients. Yeah. Lower temperatures usually don't quite kill quite as much. With the low pasteurization, it's a quick pickle, so you're not getting those prebiotics from fermentation in that particular one. So you wouldn't have to worry about killing those. But yeah, with increased heat, usually there is some loss of nutrients, yes. When I see an electric pressure canner, do I have to adjust the pressure based on elevation, or is it automatically set to the highest pressure? So, Oregon State is actually doing research on electric pressure canners and elevation, and we're still in the research phase. As of right now, we are recommending for all electric pressure canners to contact the manufacturer because they've done their own research, and Oregon State is still doing research because that is something that we really are curious about how well they do when you change elevation. And we do not test the electric pressure canners at the extension office. Yeah, we're still in the testing phase on those as universities across the nation as a whole, actually. But Oregon State is one of the ones doing the research, actually.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mandy. And I think we'll hand it off to our Emily, favorite communicable disease epidemiologist. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the spring edition of Savor the Season. My name is Emily Porter. I'm the CD Epi for DPHN. So you've heard how to grow and preserve food. I'm going to talk about how we unintentionally make people sick in the final steps. So next slide, please. Scenario 1, the potluck that sat too long. It's mid-July, about 90 degrees outside. A group of coworkers gather for a casual backyard potluck. One attendee brings a homemade pasta salad with grilled chicken made that morning and transported about 30 minutes to the event. When they arrive, the table is already full, so the dish is placed outside on a shaded table. People start eating around 1 p.m., but the food stays out the entire afternoon. Guests are grazing, going back for seconds, and no one is really thinking about time or the temperature outside. By 6 p.m., the leftovers are packed up and some people take portions home. Next slide. So what happens next? Within 12 to 36 hours, several attendees develop symptoms of diarrhea, abdominal cramping, fever, and nausea. A few people seek care and stool samples confirm salmonella infection. So what went wrong? The dish sat in the danger zone, which is 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, for over 5 hours. Warm outdoor temperatures accelerated the bacterial growth, and pasta salad with chicken is the ideal environment for bacterial growth. People continued eating from the same dish over time, which also creates ongoing exposure. So, the simple fix. This outbreak could have been prevented with a few changes. Keep cold foods cold with coolers, ice packs, shaded placement. Follow the 2-hour rule or 1 hour if it's over 90 degrees outside. And when in doubt, throw it out. So most foodborne illness does not come from something exotic. It comes from normal food sitting out just a little too long. So scenario 2, the finger food spread. It's early summer and a group of friends gather for a graduation party. There's a table full of finger foods, a charcuterie board, cut fruit, veggie trays, chips and dip, sliders, and cookies. One of the hosts had a mild stomach bug 2 days earlier. They're feeling better, just a little tired, and assume they're no longer contagious. They help set up the food, arranging trays, cutting fruit, and plating items. They use hand sanitizer a few times while prepping, but don't stop to wash their hands with soap and water. Guests arrive and eat throughout the evening, grabbing food with their hands, double dipping, and sharing serving utensils. So what happens next? Within 24 to 48 hours, multiple guests develop sudden vomiting, diarrhea, stomach cramps. Several report being violently ill overnight. This is consistent with norovirus infection, one of the most common causes of foodborne outbreaks. So what went wrong? The host was still contagious. Norovirus can shed for days after symptoms stop. Hand sanitizer was used instead of hand washing. Bare hand contact was made with ready-to-eat foods. Shared finger foods increased the spread from person to person. So hand sanitizer does not kill norovirus. What kills norovirus is soap, water, and friction. So the simple fix here is to wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially before food prep. Avoid preparing food for others if you've been sick within the last 48 hours. Use utensils or gloves with ready-to-eat foods when possible. So in outbreaks like this, it's not the food itself, it's the hands that prepared it. Scenario 3 is the medium rare mix-up. It's the 4th of July weekend. Someone brings high-quality, locally sourced beef and wants to impress. So they make burgers and steaks. They cook everything to medium rare, explaining it's good meat, I don't want to overcook it. The steaks look great, the burgers are juicy, slightly pink in the center, and everyone compliments them. So what happens next? Within 2 to 4 days, a few guests develop severe stomach cramps, diarrhea, some's bloody, little or no fever. One person ends up needing medical care, and testing confirms E. coli 0157H7 infection. So what went wrong? Steak and ground beef are not the same risk. Steak are whole cuts and the bacteria are mostly on the surface, so high heat on the outside is what kills them. The inside can be safely pink if properly handled. Ground beef, so burgers, surface bacteria gets mixed throughout during the grinding, and bacteria can be in the center. So if you have a pink metal, you have potential survival of pathogens. So the takeaway here is that you can eat a steak medium rare, but you should not eat a burger medium rare. So the simple fix here is to cook ground beef to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, no pink, juice is clear. Don't rely on color alone, use a thermometer if possible. Treat all ground meats the same way. And it's not about the quality of the meat, it's about what happens to it when it's ground up. So in conclusion, most foodborne illness is preventable. It's not typically unusual food, it's normal food, just handled slightly wrong.
Excellent. Thanks, Emily. So do we have any questions for Emily? And then if not, then we'll open up questions for Mandy or Logan. Actually, I have a question for Emily. Is there any specific foods, say at a potluck or at a buffet, that you typically avoid for yourself?
I don't think I typically avoid the foods, but I do keep in mind that there are certain foods that don't have built-in kill steps. So typically raw foods like lettuce or strawberries typically aren't cooked. So kind of knowing that that is a calculated risk. But I wouldn't say that there are, I mean, I guess if you saw something like cheese and you could tell that it's been out for a while, if you can tell that it's been out for a while, I would avoid it.
That's good advice. And I see Mandy added something about pasteurization. Do you want to come on camera and speak to that, Mandy?
Oh, I was just like, oh man, I know that a few of the vitamins off the top of my head that are heat sensitive, but I had to look up with low temperature pasteurization which ones. So it says for typical for 30 minutes, it's minimal nutrient loss. The ones that are affected are the heat sensitive. So certain vitamins are heat sensitive, some vitamins and minerals, I should say, and some are light sensitive, so how you store them affects it. But for the heat, it's B2, B12, C, and folate that seem to be the most affected, but only small quantities are lost.
Excellent. Thanks for looking that up. Other folks have questions for any of our panelists? Mandy, I was actually going to ask, could you list the website that you listed last time on preserving foods? It's a national site for lots of different tried and tested recipes for preserving. Can't remember the name of it.
Yeah. So it's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And it has they do the majority of the testing for the nation, and so and they're wonderful, and they have really good outlines on how to do things and the processes in which you do. They're coming out with a new updated cookbook, hopefully by the end of this summer. It's called So Easy to Preserve, and so be looking for that. They have really good instructions in their recipes.
Great, thank you. There was a question in the chat. I think last year there was a fungus disease on strawberry picking. Is that still the case?
That might be a Mandy, Emily, or Logan question. Typically in strawberries, what you're going to see is a fungal disease called botrytis. It's super common, especially in areas where the strawberries are overhead irrigated. Botrytis can appear during fruiting, during picking, and after fruiting. So the main thing is just making sure that the strawberries are kept dry and away from specific like fungal pathogens. There have been some reports over the last year of a different fungal disease, but so far I haven't heard anything this year in terms of you pick strawberries and fungal diseases.
Great. Thank you, Logan. Mandy or Emily, do you want to add anything to that? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. If you do have any last minute questions, feel free to put them in there. Just as a reminder, we're going to be doing the virtual door prize raffle for the books. So watch your email for that. Also, our next webinar is going to be May 6th, and we're going to have 4 panelists, and they're going to be talking about wildfire safety and summer readiness. We're going to have somebody from Oregon State Fire Marshal's office. We're going to have our undersheriff from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. We're going to have somebody from Douglas Forest Protective Association or DFPA, and then also somebody from OSU Extension Office to talk about plants and protective plants for wildfire safety. So please join us for that, and watch for, again, on our website, we have all of our webinars listed there, and then watch for the video for this one. They'll come out probably in the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for your great input on food preservation and gardening, and it's getting me all excited. I wrote down lots of notes. So thank you all for your time